Hi, and welcome to Smuggling Hope. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about how your married sex life can get you to heaven. And as a pretense on this is going to have a lot of adult language. So if you have little kids that are going to be listening, please listen to this first because you're the parent. So this is really designed for married couples or those that are of an adult caliber, because this is going to be technical language. So I don't want you to have to explain things that you don't want to explain to your kids. So so that being said, the other thing I want you to think about is I really do appreciate everything that you guys have been doing in terms of listening to the show and being supportive in terms of your feedback, questions, topics, suggestions on guests. Today I'm going to be joined by Ellen in a minute, and we're going to talk about her work, and especially her work to really position the role and function of sex back in marriage as a joyful thing. But I really appreciate all of your continued support. And for those of you that have already subscribed to the channel, thank you. So if you're on Spotify or if you're watching us on YouTube, just hit subscribe. That helps us to continue to attract an audience and grow interest in this material, so it reaches more and more people. So really helpful. The other thing is right now, if you are a married couple, a Catholic married couple, you really want to check out our online marriage course at Hearts Renewed. That is the dynamic, all-encompassing marriage course for Catholic married couples, whether you're pre-married, you're just engaged, or whether you've been married for 40 years. Every Catholic couple should take a look at that program, because it encompasses everything that you were never taught in pre-Cana, everything you were never taught by your own parents, and everything that they really leave out in marriage and couples counseling. And we put that together over a course of 7 years so that these marriages can be holy, inspiring, joyful. So I'm glad to be joined by Ellen today. So check that out at Hearts Renewed. Again, you can check the program out for $1. So take a look at it. And so on with the show. Hi, and welcome back to Smuggling Hope. It's another incredible conversation we're going to have today with Ellen Holloway, and I appreciate you guys for all joining us in this conversation. As you know, we've been talking a lot over the last couple months about marriage and the importance of holy, healthy sex and intimacy. Ellen is agreed to join me today, and she's got a lot of great information and a lot of great resources. She's a Catholic speaker and coach who promotes holy and healthy sex and intimacy for Catholic women and couples through her business, which is Vines in Full Bloom, and through her podcast, which is entitled Charting Toward Intimacy. I think that's something to do with like NFP, right? Maybe, or maybe
Yep,
for those
it's
people who
a little play on NFP.
Okay. She holds a certificate in the fundamentals of sex therapy from the Buehler Institute and is in pursuit of her master's of sacred arts and theology of the body and the new evangelization through the Pontificate University, right? Or Pontifex?
Pontifex, yeah.
Pontifex University. And she lives in California, so I appreciate you with the time change here. And she lives with her husband and 3 children, right? So wonderful to have you on the show, and I really do appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule with all of your kids. Somehow you were able to get them all, where they needed to be for the little bit of time we got.
Settled
So
for a little bit now.
yeah, so I guess to get us started, what would you say has been one of the most powerful insights that you've gained through this whole journey as you've been really trying to work with married couples and women, especially in this area of sex and marriage and intimacy? Like, what is one of the most powerful insights that you've gained so far?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a good question. Honestly, I think something that has not only helped me, but also just so many of my listeners after, receiving this insight is just how good and how holy sex really is in a marriage, and how much God really wants couples to engage in this vulnerable, intimate, beautiful, unifying act. And that just puts so much power behind what I am trying to do, which is just promoting the goodness and the truth and the beauty of sex and intimacy. It's not that the Catholic Church is down on sex and has all these rules and is trying to make it so that it's not very fun. It's that the Catholic Church recognizes that sex is going to get you to heaven. Good, holy, intimate, vulnerable, self-giving sex is going to get you to heaven with your spouse. And the church wants you to use this wonderful tool to do that. And so if we're going to do that, then we need to do that within the bounds of the way that sex was designed as a unifying and procreative act. And so that's where, teachings about natural family planning and those kinds of things, and sex before marriage and things like that come into play, because it all has to do with the goodness and the sacredness and the beauty of the act.
I think it's powerful. I love that, like that I guess that direction, or that mantra of that this vulnerable act of gift of self, sex, is going to get you to heaven. Can you explain that to people, like what you mean by that? How is sex going to get them to heaven? Sex in marriage, just so we're all clear, because I think a lot of people
Absolutely right.
just
Sex in
make
marriage.
sure that. Yeah. So when you say sex will get you to heaven, what do you mean?
Well, and this is something that, gosh, I don't know why, but it's not taught to couples who are preparing for marriage. But sex is a way that married couples can image the Trinity, the self giving, never ending relationship and communion that is present in the Trinity. So, one way to explain the Trinity is we have God the Father, who initiates the gift of love to God the Son, Jesus, right? And Jesus perfectly receives that gift of love. And in receiving that gift of love, he gives himself back to the Father as a perfect gift of love. This is what we see on the cross, right? Jesus perfectly receiving God's love, giving himself as a gift. And that love, so then that's received by the Father, given back to the Son. There's just this like spiral that continues on and on and on. And the love between the Father and Son is the Holy Spirit. And so if we look at sex, we can actually allow the biological to inform the theological aspect of sex. So we have man and wife. And in this image, the man is imaging God the Father in that he is initiating the gift. There is a physical gift of self that the man gives in sex. I'm talking about semen, literal physical part of himself is given. And the woman fully receives that into her in incredible way, right? In this biological way. But this biology is also showing us a deeper soul level theological truth here that each husband and wife are giving fully of themselves. So the woman, in receiving that gift, is then giving herself as a gift to her spouse, and her spouse is receiving that full gift of her into himself. And we have this same spiral going on. And then sometimes that spiral results in a third person, right? We get a baby out of sex. So we have this really cool image of the Trinity present every time that husband and wife come together in a full gift of self, not in a coercive act, not in an unloving, selfish act. I'm talking about when husband and wife come together, fully intending to give of themselves as a gift to their spouse. And there we have this deep imagery. We're seeing God in our marriage. And that is like opening up the floodgates of God's grace into our marriage. And that's what's going to get us to heaven, is God's grace.
Powerful though, because like you said, like that sex then is both physically, and then like it reflects a spiritual reality, right? And then there is obviously the procreation, the ability for us to, create a new life. But there is also this, it should be an outflowing of grace into people's marriages, right? Because it reflects the theology of God's relationship with himself, right? Because God lives in community. So very powerful. I guess as you're talking, we talk about like different things, and one of the things that I guess that I've seen a lot with younger people, especially teenage people, is there's a lot of pressure for them to be involving themselves in like sex outside of marriage, right? And I guess like and a lot of people get married and they've had sex outside of marriage, right? And so, can you speak about like why why sex is so important that it be put in marriage, and like maybe why these other things that seem to be being promoted by the culture can really damage people's experience of either God's grace or maybe like their experience of what God really has intent, or what God intends in their marriage.
Yeah. A lot of times I like to say, the church doesn't say no to sex because it's bad before marriage. The church says no to sex because it's so holy that it doesn't make sense outside of marriage. Because what I just explained in that Trinitarian image that we have in a sexual relationship is a full and complete gift of self. And we as humans, we are finite beings. We do not have the ability to actually fully give of ourselves. We actually cannot do that. We strive to do that. And when we get to heaven, we will be able to embrace the full gift of ourself to God.
Mm.
But we physically, we like mentally, soul level, we can't fully give up ourselves. But the closest that we can get to that is when we put ourselves in a covenantal relationship. And that is the bond of marriage. Marriage is a sacrament. It is the primordial sacrament. That means that it's where the sacraments came from. That's what we see with Adam and Eve. That's the marriage is that first like inflowing, indwelling of God into humanity. The other sacraments like spin off sort of, or not spin off, that's kind of the wrong terminology, but there is a root of marriage in every sacrament. Every sacrament has a marital imagery to it. And that's probably a conversation for another time. But that covenantal permanence that we have in marriage is what allows us as humans to actually give a full gift of self. We're as close to a full gift of self as we can. Sex isn't sex. It's not what sex was intended to be if it is not given as a full gift of self. And outside of marriage, that's not possible. Because look, outside of marriage, we're not seeking to have a child. We're not open to life in, I think, 98% of the cases, right?
Well,
Outside of marriage, we're not looking at permanence, but a gift of self requires that openness and that permanence.
yeah.
And that's just not available to the human brain outside of marriage.
I think that that's very powerful. I mean, I think that the way that you phrase it, I think is very easy for people to understand from the understanding of logic, right? And
Yeah.
again, like
I'm
I
a
always,
really logical person.
I don't know if that's a joke. I don't know if that's you're being honest. I don't know, but I think that no, I think that, but it's very concrete in the sense that again, like the human person, can it really make a gift of self within all of these? In many ways, marriage produces the freedom for people to make that gift, like you said. And without marriage, there is no freedom. And yet people are told that doing this is free. But it's actually, I think John Paul II said this all the time, is that our bodies start like lying, right? When we do these things, it's a lie. My body says that I want all of this, but I don't. What I mean? And so I think then there's a disharmony where people, they're not very much they don't feel connected, right? So I think it's the way you framed it up makes a lot of sense. I hope people like replay that part, just because it's not it's not like a these aren't rules to confine people. They're rules that really are designed so that, like you said, because these things are powerful, because these things have this capacity. And I think people forget that, yeah, marriage is the only sacrament that pre-exists the fall. It is the original thing, right? And and people forget that. And that I think that, in terms of the work that you're doing, it's super important, because a lot of people don't think that their sexual relationship, that gift of self in the sexual marital act is sacramental. And so to realize that, and so like it's kind of like, well, I received the Eucharist, and the Eucharist is in many ways the summit of the Catholic faith. It is the fullness of God given to us. And the next thing, I forget which pope said it, the next most intensely important thing really is human sexuality. So again,
Mm.
maybe I'm wrong or mishearing that, but that's why these two things are so under attack, right? We have the world which really doesn't understand the Eucharist at all, right? There's massive confusion in our own church and outside. And also then there's a massive confusion about sexuality, right? It's kind of
Mhm.
really twisted. And I think the world has ruined sex because it talks about it and shows it in all these weird, you know, like very absurd fashions. And then people don't know how to, it's like they talk about it all the time, but nobody does it very well, or nobody understands like the importance of it. Right? So no, I think it's very, I think it's super important what you just said though. So, as you've done all of this work with married couples, and especially with the women that will do your program or have coached with you, and gone through your work, what are the some of the big things that you think couples really need to understand or start to unpack or whatnot, so that they can have the kind of marriage and the kind of sexual union like that God God really wanted for them.
Yeah. I have two things coming to mind here. The first one is that sexual pleasure was designed by God and is equally important in the man as well as the woman. And a lot of times there's a lot of confusion around this, because if we're looking at the moral act of sex, morally speaking, ejaculation has to happen during intercourse, meaning that the man's penis is inside of the vagina, has to be present for the act to be moral. So ejaculation cannot happen outside of the vagina. And if you want to dig into the why on that more, we can. But if not, we can kind of leave it there. And I want to direct you over to a whole bunch of podcast episodes on my podcast where we talk about that very specifically. Basically, anything that has the word licit or illicit acts in the title, you're going to hear it in there. That moral act, we focus on that a lot because we're like, okay, we don't want to break the rules, right? We don't want to break the rules of sex. And when we look at sexual pleasure, the moral act ends up also encompassing the man's sexual pleasure in it, because orgasm and ejaculation in male biology in 99.9% of men are inherently connected. They happen at the same time or within a very short amount of time together. Whereas female sexual pleasure and her orgasm is not connected to the procreative aspect of sex. Her orgasm is possible without like that procreative possibility being present, right? So the male procreative possibility is that ejaculation and his semen. The woman's procreative possibility is her body ovulating and that egg being present. Ovulation happens totally separately from sex, sexual
Yeah,
pleasure, etc.
it's already
Um,
happened.
it's already happened, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And so a lot of times there can be this frustration because it's like, oh, it seems like the church cares more about male sexual pleasure than female sexual
Mhm.
pleasure, because male sexual pleasure is really stuck in there with the moral act. But it actually has nothing to do with male sexual pleasure. There are men who can experience orgasm without ejaculation and who can experience ejaculation without orgasm. If a man experienced ejaculation without orgasm during a moral act of intercourse, then it would be a perfectly moral act without his orgasm. His sexual pleasure has nothing to do with the morality of the act. And so we have to see that for
Sure.
what it is and recognize that actually, and I love the way that John Paul II, well, when he was Bishop, Carol Wojtyła,
Yeah.
in Love and Responsibility, he actually calls it a justice issue when husband and wife don't both reach climax during a full sexual act. And that full sexual act isn't just intercourse. That
Mm.
is foreplay plus intercourse plus maybe some afterplay if that's desired by the spouses. One sexual act means simply like one chunk of time, right? They're not separated. We don't have foreplay and then 20 minutes later have intercourse, like, or
Yeah.
foreplay and then pause for 20 minutes, I mean, and then have
Mhm.
intercourse. Like foreplay is a part of having sex. That might be 10 minutes, that might be 20, it might be an hour of foreplay. All of that would still be like one sexual act. And so the woman's orgasm actually is able to happen at any point during the sexual act because it's not connected to that procreative possibility, whereas the man's orgasm does need to happen during intercourse because it's connected to ejaculation, and ejaculation needs to happen during intercourse for it to be a moral action. But anyway, all of that to say that female sexual pleasure is equally as important as male sexual pleasure. And a lot of times it is just put to the side because it's a little bit harder to get. It takes a little bit more work. It takes a lot more focus. It takes learning some things that maybe we were never taught before and we didn't understand about our brains and foreplay and just the sexual organs that we have and the anatomy of the clitoris, all of those kinds of things. And so that was one of two. This is becoming a long answer to your question. And that is why I created the orgasm course for Catholic women. It is just all about orgasm from both a biological and theological sides and understanding just the beauty of sexual pleasure and why it was designed. And then the other thing that was coming to mind of just like really important, necessary things for couples is communication when it comes to sex and talking about sex. One of the things that I've realized is that a lot of couples, there's a fundamental conversation they need to have probably now, probably tonight is, hey, sex is a thing that we do. Actually putting it out there and actually verbally discussing the fact that the two of you have sex. Because in most of the women that I encounter, when I talk to them about, bringing something up about sex, it's always in the context of, oh my gosh, the last time I brought something up about sex, we were fighting and we fought about this. And it was so negative. And that's because we're not regularly allowing sex to be a part of our natural conversation as husband and wife. Yes, it should be in a private setting. We don't really need to be talking about sex at the dinner table around your kids, right? Unless it's like, an appropriate conversation. And, I think there could be conversations about sex that might be appropriate at the dinner table, but you don't need to talk about your personal sexual relationship in front of your kids. But sex cannot just be something that we only argue about. And that first fundamental step is making sure that you and your spouse both can verbally acknowledge the fact that sex is something that you have. You do sex together, not just having it be this silent part of your relationship that is only brought up right at the point of initiation and maybe not even ever brought up with words. If initiation is done with, looks and nods and points and moving covers and things like that, that's actually really not healthy. Like, we should be verbally talking about the fact that we have sex.
Yeah. Well, I think that's powerful. I find it funny, like when I think about people who have a pretty healthy sex life. I don't know if you agree with this, but they can either they can bring up sex with their spouse easily, but they can also kind of defer sex. Like they can say, no, this isn't going to work today, and they can turn each other down easily. Those are the people that, at least that I've experienced, that have, like, I would say, the healthiest sex life. I mean, I don't know. Does that concur with like your experience or your research with the communication about it all?
Yeah. One of the things I think a really solid litmus test is basically what you were just saying is if sex can be turned down, like if an initiation can be turned down and both spouses are like, okay, after that, right? You don't have to be like ecstatic that you don't get to have sex, right? But like if an initiation can be, no, it's not going to happen tonight. And it's like, okay, then that's very, very healthy. But if declining initiation turns into, there's now this elephant in the room, there's this frustration, there's this annoyance or grudges or anything like that gets dug up when an initiation is turned down, then there's more to talk.
Well, I think for you, like as you're talking about this, like the communication, how How do you think that people can go about having more of these courageous conversations about sex? Like with their
So
spouse, like bringing it up because it's a delicate thing, and people have baggage. People have a lot of sex promotes a lot of shame for people for whatever reason too. Like which again, like I think that your work is really to try to unshame everything. Like, so how do we help people to have conversations like that?
the thing that I recommend to all of my clients, and this is like all over my courses, like
Yeah,
everything, is talk about sex every single day. Make a plan to set aside 5 minutes. It does not have to be long. That you and your spouse talk about sex every single day. And this is going to do a couple of things. One, it's short. So you don't have to you don't have to gear yourself up for too much. Like
sure.
you're just talking for a few minutes. Two, you're going to talk again the next day. So if something gets brought up that is uncomfortable, or you just feel like you need to think about it before you respond, or it's hard, something just really hard to talk about, you don't have to solve the problem in that moment. And that is where I see a lot of the issues that couples have with talking about sex, is that because it's not a normal conversation topic, it's not a comfortable conversation topic, it difficulties with sex kind of pile up until a breaking point that something has to be said. And then there's this feeling of, I have to get it all out now, because who knows the next time that we're actually going to have this conversation again.
Yeah,
And it becomes this full, and that's where arguments come from, because there's this like pressure to get your side across and make sure your spouse understands what you're saying, and cover it all
of
in
course.
one big, huge blowout conversation. And like, that is a lot of work. That is stressful. Whereas if
Yeah,
instead, that you have 5 minutes every single day, if there is something that is difficult, maybe you don't like the way that your husband initiates. You don't like the words he uses, or maybe the lack of words or something like that. You can bring it up, and then your husband, like, he doesn't have to get everything out at that point. You don't have to get everything out at that point. You can talk about it again tomorrow and the next day, and you can continue the conversation, have time away from each other to think about things, think about what the other person said, process what you talked about the day before, and just know that you've got time to talk about it again in the future. And you already know when that's going to happen. You don't have this pressure
yeah.
in every single conversation about sex to get it all out.
That's important. Is to get rid of anything that removes pressure will help to increase people's ability to relax and get rid of like the agitation about all of this. Because again, I think it's a familiarity thing, right? If the only time we talk about sex is 2 minutes or a minute or 30 seconds or after it happens or while it's happening or whatever it is, that's a problem. And I think that, yeah, and I think that people really I find it that people get they get very uncomfortable sometimes, obviously
Mhm.
with that. So that's wonderful. Like, so to have them talk every day, like you said, for a couple minutes about sex and, and really like, so that gets rid of, I guess, all of the pressurized stuff that could turn into resentment or bad habits of connection or whatever it is that people get into. Good. I think that that's a really important. I think it's super important, like with just learning how to talk. How come you think people have so much like difficulty talking about sex? Like, how come they can't, especially Catholics? It's like you see these people, they have a bunch of kids, and it's like they don't know where they came from or something.
Right. I remember seeing this reel on Instagram one time, and it was this woman who was pregnant, and she was like, "Oh, this is my sixth kid." And but then all of a sudden, she's dancing around pregnant, super pregnant with her sixth kid. And then she gets this like really embarrassed look on her face and covers her mouth, and then the words on the screen are just like, "I hope my parents don't think too much about where these kids came from." And that reel just like opened up for me the answer to your question right there. And it is that we all have this negative shame about sex.
Mm,
And we are ashamed even within marriage, when it is perfectly licit, perfectly moral, and in fact, an incredibly good and holy thing to do, we're
Yeah.
ashamed of the fact that we're having sex. And I think a lot of that stems from just some, you know, of the way that sex was talked about when we were growing up. Maybe it wasn't talked about in a very healthy way. It was a quiet subject. Maybe it was kind of pushed to the side. Maybe it wasn't talked about at all. So you didn't
Yeah.
really know, like, what about sex? Maybe it was talked about in a negative way, like you will be permanently stained if you have sex before marriage. And those examples of like the water balloon, and your heart is a water balloon. And every time you have sex, you prick your water balloon, and so a little bit of it deflates, and you want to be able to present this perfectly full water balloon to your husband, and so don't prick your balloon before you get married. Or you are a piece of tape, and every time you have sex, you rip the piece of tape off, and so it sticks less after you have sex for so long. Those kinds of images, well, what they're trying to do is talk about the goodness and holiness of married sex and say, like, look, sex is not worth it before marriage. And in fact, it like doesn't even make sense before marriage. They're trying to do something good, but in fact, they are like messing with our brains so much as women. These are all in like the girls' talks. I
Yeah.
don't know. The guys' talks talk about different things. The girls' talks are like water balloons and tape. It's ridiculous.
I've never heard those ones. Yeah. So
See, I'm telling you.
I get an education every time I go on these programs.
But what they're doing is they're messing with our brain, and we are internalizing that sex is bad. I am bad if I have sex. If I have any interest in sex, I am bad. And so then it's like we get married. I remember my cousin, there was like this, the day after her wedding, somebody needed to pick them up from their hotel and take them to the airport. And my cousin was like so embarrassed about who would be picking her up and taking her to the airport because they know she had sex for the first time. And there's just like so much shame around this. And there shouldn't be. Like, I mean, oh my gosh, in Italy, this was like not like today, but centuries ago. Like
Yeah.
the mother-in-law would come and take the bloody sheets and put them outside of the apartment as like this joyous occasion of like, look, my son and his new bride had sex and we're so happy about it. And like, I'm not saying that we need to display bloody sheets after having sex for the first time, but what we do need to do is look at shame and recognize that there's good shame and there's bad shame. Our human condition naturally puts shame around sex to protect us because sex is so intimate and so vulnerable. There is positive shame that forces us to turn that into a private like interaction, right? So
Yeah.
if you just, your immediate reaction to me saying, hey, let's go have sex in the middle of the street should be of incredible shame. Like, oh my gosh, no, right? That's good shame. We should not want to have sex in a public place. Sex should be a private interaction because it's so vulnerable and so intimate, so holy. But that shame, unfortunately, the good shame can also eke into turning into a bad shame where we have shame around everything to do with the act. And then we have shame, like some of the things I was explaining, like my cousin who couldn't even fathom who was going to take her to the airport because she didn't want that person to like see her after having sex. And I mean, honestly, that was probably me right when I first started getting married. Like this is part of my story is just all of this negative shame around sex. And so we have to kind of look at shame and root out what are the ways that shame is negatively impacting me and just toss that out the window. We don't need any of that. We can keep the good shame, keep the act private, that kind of
Cool.
thing. That's good. But get rid of the bad shame.
Well, I think that that's powerful. As you're talking, I was thinking, what about like, I mean, there are many people who, unfortunately, like you used with this illustration, or they've been scarred by this illustration of like the unsticky tape or the punctured balloon, but they want holy marriage, right? And sometimes I don't think that they have a voice like yours that says, yes, you're good, sex is holy, sex is good, just like you are. And instead they hear, "Oh, I've screwed up. I've had these relationships before, and I love my husband, and this really is screwing with me. The shame is really screwing with me, because I carry the weight of these, I don't know, these past sins or like these other relationships or the baggage from relationships." What I guess would be your direction for those individuals that are trying to engage in holy marriage and encounter their goodness in their marriage with their husband, but they're carrying all of this stuff from, their past, I guess, and all this negative, because it's like a very puritanical version of it, or that we've all got to walk around with the scarlet letter or something.
Yeah.
So, like, what I guess is I guess your direction with people when they're struggling with that kind of stuff, so that they can come back to a joyful, like holy marriage and a sexual union with their spouse.
Yeah. One of the exercises that I like to recommend to my one-on-one clients is, as you're going throughout your day, whenever you have one of those really like negative thoughts about sex, that kind of puritanical or, you know, feeling like that negative, that shame around sex or things like that, to take note of them and literally like write them down. So either in a note on your phone, or maybe you have a notebook if you're in the same place all day, if you're at
Sure.
home or whatever, you can have a notebook. Phones work really well for that. And then at the end of the day, rewrite all of those into the positive, right? So if a thought that you had was, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed about the fact that my husband and I have sex, right? You can
Sure.
rewrite that to, sex is a good and holy thing for me to do as a married woman. Of
Yeah.
course, I'm speaking from the female side of things because I'm a woman,
Sure.
but if you're a man, switch it around, right? And then use those. So you're going to continue to do this over the course of a week or so. But each morning, then you're going to tell yourself out loud the, flips that you made of those negative statements, and just
Uh-huh.
really like writing them out, telling yourself out loud. I really like actually saying it out loud, because when you can hear your own voice say it, you hear it externally and internally. That's how
Yeah.
we process our own voice, which is like really powerful when it can be external and internal. So you're going to say what you flipped of those scripts that you were saying in your head. You're going to say them to yourself. And then throughout the day again, right, you're going to take note of any of those negative thoughts that you're having about sex. And at the end of the day, rewrite those. And the next morning, you're going to say those rewrites to yourself in the morning, and any from the day before that were really good.
All right.
And then by the end of a week, you should have a nice chunk of just positive scripts about sex and intimacy. And then you're just going to start your day every day with 3 or 4 of those. You're going to say them out loud. You're going to write them down, whatever works for you. And you're going to fill your mind with the goodness and the beauty of sex and intimacy. Another solid way to fill your mind, and this, I always hesitate a little bit saying this because I'm not just trying to like promote my podcast here, but this is like actually fundamentally how this works. But again, if you're trying to fill your mind with something, find a resource that does that and fill your ears with it. So my podcast is all about the goodness and beauty and holiness of sex. So there's like 170 episodes. You're not going to exhaust them anytime soon. Like, listen to the Charting Toward Intimacy podcast. Read books like Holy Sex by Dr. Gregory Popcak. It's great. That has some great conversation starters as well with you and your spouse.
Yeah.
Let's see, other books. Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love by Dr. Edward Stree is really good. Good News About Sex and Marriage by Dr. Christopher West is really good. Allowing what is about sex to be really good and positive, and just trying to like weed out anything that is negative. Maybe you are like still somehow talking to your mom about sex in some capacity and it's like very negative. Just push those conversations out of your like purview. You got to get rid of the negative and your whole life with the positive, and that's what's going to help you untwist those negative associations that you have with sex.
I think that that's very powerful. I mean, I think that the changing the diet you feed your mind is going to be of a great benefit. And obviously, like you said, you have a lot of materials to offer. And I think, as we kind of close up here, like there's a bunch of different things for you. What, how is it you want to go through like how people can access you or the resources you have? Obviously, you have Charting Toward Intimacy as your podcast, and I will have that in the show notes as well. What other things can people benefit from working with you, or how can they access your resources?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of courses and resources. My courses are typically focused toward women. So I have the Catholic Sex course for women. This is the course that every single woman should take. This is this is everything. We cover what the church teaches, what sex actually is, to the sex ed that you didn't get, like diving into the anatomy that you never were taught for some weird reason. We learn all about male anatomy. We learn very little about the external female anatomy, to communication within a marriage, to arousal curves and libido. We talk about just really everything that there is about sex. That's the Catholic Sex course for women. And then I also mentioned that orgasm course that I have. That one is just very pinpointed toward orgasm specifically. And then for couples, a resource that I have is I actually created a Catholic sex positions guide. I realized that there was just this desire to have some really practical sex education, sex information for married couples that was appropriate, morally licit, and also just actually explained the Catholic side of things. And so that's what the sex positions guide is, which is really fun. I've gotten a lot of feedback from it that it's awesome. There are over 50 positions in there. There's also a bonus foreplay. There's also a bonus foreplay guide that is the actual like what and how. It's
Wow.
specific instead of just being like, oh, here's foreplay, like figure it out. It's like, here are some things that you can actually do
Yeah.
and try and see what works.
Well, that's awesome, though. I mean, I figure like I think that you've helped to elevate sex back to where it should be, and like again, and obviously for couples to see it as, like you said, holy and pleasurable, and especially to elevate the position that both men and women's pleasure and sexual experience are really important to be both cherished and respected. So I think that this is powerful. So I will have access to like the or links in the show notes to all of the podcast, and then obviously the your website and the different the you got your positions guide here, the orgasm course, and then the Catholic sex guide, right? Cool. I'd love to ask you at some point, not on this because we got to go, but I think I always gotta ask people, like, do you ever think that you would be the person talking about this stuff? Some, it's interesting, right? Not.
Absolutely not. If you asked 14-year-old Ellen, who was deep in the throes of like this negative purity culture understanding of what sex was, if you
Yeah,
told me that I would be running a business by myself as a married Catholic woman with 3 children, and that business was all about sex and intimacy, I would be like, no, you have the wrong person,
yeah.
clearly.
Well, obviously, you responded to the call that God's placed in your heart, so it's wonderful, and your ministry and your business seems to be flourishing, so it's awesome. Hopefully, more people will take advantage of it, so that when people have marriages that are joyful and are attractive
Absolutely.
to, and maybe they make other people uncomfortable, right? So who knows? A little bit. So, well, thank you so much, Alan. I appreciate it. And like I said, God bless you with all of your work. And for all the people listening, like, check out her resources down in the show notes. And hopefully we'll have you on again at some point, whenever you're available. You're, doing a lot of stuff. So hopefully you get some downtime. So thank you again. Okay. You take care.